Some people mistake silence for weakness. That was Nathaniel Brooks's first mistake. Rain crawled down the glass walls of Brooks' Capitol Tower like slow silver tears, while Manhattan disappeared beneath a storm of blurred headlights and cold white fog. 52 floors above the streets, the executive boardroom glowed with polished marble, soft recessed lighting, and the kind of quiet wealth that made people lower their voices without realizing it. A 12-foot digital screen stretched across the wall, displaying projections for a $200 million acquisition that every financial news outlet in America was already calling the deal of the year. Men in charcoal suits sat perfectly still around the black walnut conference table, their watches catching flashes of light whenever they moved their hands. Expensive pens, crystal water glasses, leather folders stamped with gold initials. Everything in the room felt sharp, controlled, intentional. And at the center of it all stood Nathaniel Brooks. 39 years old, 6'2", steel gray suit tailored so precisely it looked carved onto him instead of stitched together. The CEO of Brooks Capital rarely raised his voice because he never had to. One glance from him usually did the work. "Why?" he asked quietly, staring at the presentation screen. "Does this report show two different operating margins?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence thickened. One of the junior analysts swallowed hard. Another avoided eye contact entirely. At the far end of the table, CFO Daniel Mercer shifted uncomfortably in his seat and adjusted his glasses. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I asked a very simple question." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the Hudson River. Inside, nobody breathed. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "There appears to have been a formatting issue in the revised projections." Nathaniel slowly turned toward him. "Calm. Dangerous. A formatting issue." His voice remained smooth, but the room temperature somehow felt 10 degrees colder. "You're presenting a $200 million acquisition to international investors tomorrow morning, and your explanation is formatting?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. Nobody moved. The only sound came from the faint ticking of the Swiss clock mounted near the glass doors. Tick, tick, tick. At that exact moment, the boardroom doors opened quietly, and a young waitress stepped inside carrying a silver tray of fresh coffee. Nobody looked at her. Nobody ever looked at the catering staff in rooms like this. Claire Bennett moved carefully across the marble floor in a simple black uniform with her blonde hair tied neatly behind her neck. 28 years old. Pale skin. Calm blue eyes. Soft movements that almost disappeared into the room itself. She placed a cup beside one of the investors without interrupting the meeting. Nathaniel continued staring at the financial report with growing irritation. "Do any of you understand how embarrassing this is?" he asked. "Because apparently I'm the only person in this room capable of reading a balance sheet." One nervous laugh escaped from someone near the end of the table. Nobody else joined in. Claire reached forward to place another coffee cup beside Daniel Mercer when the man's trembling elbow accidentally hit the edge of her tray. A thin stream of dark coffee spilled across the polished glass table. Only a few drops, barely noticeable, but in that room, it felt catastrophic. Claire immediately grabbed a linen cloth. "I'm sorry, sir." Nathaniel looked down at the coffee near his financial documents, then slowly lifted his eyes toward her. For the first time since she entered the room, he actually saw her. And unfortunately for Claire, he was already angry. "Careful," he said coldly. "Some numbers on this table are worth more than your entire life." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. Nobody challenged him. Nobody ever challenged Nathaniel Brooks inside his own building. Claire froze for only a second. Then she lowered her eyes slightly and continued wiping the table in silence. Calm, controlled, professional. But as she leaned closer to clean the spill, something on the presentation screen caught her attention. Her eyes moved across the projected financial model. Revenue projections, debt ratios, acquisition costs. Then suddenly, her hand stopped moving. Just for a moment. A tiny pause almost nobody noticed. Almost. Investor Charles Whitmore watched her from across the table with quiet curiosity. Claire stared at one specific line in the report. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. Nathaniel noticed the pause immediately. "Problem?" he asked flatly. Claire looked up slowly. Rain tapped against the glass walls behind her, while lightning briefly illuminated the skyline in cold white flashes. She hesitated, not because she was afraid, because she was deciding whether speaking was worth the consequences. Sir, her voice was soft, respectful. I think there may be an error in the acquisition model. The room went completely still. One investor blinked in disbelief. Another actually let out a short laugh before quickly stopping himself. Daniel Mercer frowned. Nathaniel stared at her like he hadn't heard correctly. Excuse me. Claire looked toward the giant screen again. The projected integration costs are misaligned against the second quarter cash flow assumptions, she said carefully. If those numbers are accurate, the acquisition won't remain stable through the first fiscal year. Silence. Absolute silence. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair. Not angry now. Interested. Dangerous in an entirely different way. You're telling me, he said quietly, that a waitress just walked into my boardroom and found a problem my executive team missed? Claire lowered her cloth onto the silver tray. I could be wrong. Calm. No arrogance. No performance. Somehow that made it worse. Daniel immediately shook his head. That's impossible. Those numbers were reviewed 6 times. Claire nodded politely. Then maybe you should review them a 7th. A sharp inhale moved through the room. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Somewhere deep in the building, thunder echoed again. And for the first time that evening, nobody in the boardroom was looking at the screen anymore. They were all looking at her. The silence inside the boardroom no longer felt expensive. It felt dangerous. Rain continued sliding down the massive glass windows while the city below dissolved into rivers of red brake lights and pale reflections. Nobody touched their coffee. Nobody checked their phones. Even the investors who normally interrupted every presentation with impatient questions remained completely still. Claire Bennett stood beside the conference table holding a silver tray against her side, while 12 executives stared at her like she had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Nathaniel Brooks slowly leaned back into his chair, one hand resting near the untouched espresso beside him. His expression remained controlled, but something had changed behind his eyes. Curiosity, sharp and cold. Show me, he said finally. Claire hesitated. Not dramatically, not nervously, just enough to suggest she understood exactly how dangerous this moment could become. Sir, I am probably overstepping. You already did, Nathaniel replied calmly. Now continue. Somewhere near the back of the room, Daniel Mercer exhaled through his nose in irritation. Nathaniel, with all due respect, we cannot seriously pause a board review because a catering employee thinks she found an accounting issue. Claire immediately lowered her gaze slightly. He is right. I should get back downstairs. But Nathaniel did not look at Daniel. His eyes stayed on Claire. No, he said quietly. I want to hear this. The room shifted uncomfortably. Nathaniel Brooks was famous for many things on Wall Street. Patience was not one of them. Yet somehow this unknown waitress had held his attention longer than half the analysts inside his company. Claire carefully set the tray down near the edge of the table and stepped toward the giant presentation screen. The soft click of her shoes against the marble floor sounded strangely loud in the silence. She folded her hands briefly in front of her, studying the financial projections with calm concentration. No shaking, no performance, just focus. The integration model assumes operating efficiency will improve by 18% within 6 months, she said softly. But the debt servicing ratio was calculated using last year's labor costs instead of projected post-acquisition expenses. Daniel frowned immediately. That is not possible. Claire nodded once. It is if the revised staffing projections were imported before the final compliance adjustments. One of the investors blinked. Another quietly opened the printed report again. Nathaniel's expression hardened slightly. Can you prove it? Claire stepped closer to the screen and pointed carefully toward the lower corner of the financial chart. Right there. Her voice remained steady. The second quarter adjustment duplicates the projected savings while counting the restructuring costs separately. Daniel grabbed his tablet immediately, fingers moving faster now. The room filled with the faint sounds of scrolling screens and turning pages. Tick, tick, tick. The Swiss clock continued measuring every second of silence. Then suddenly Daniel stopped typing. His face lost color. Just slightly, but enough. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Daniel. No answer. Daniel. The CFO swallowed hard. She might be correct. The sentence landed in the room like broken glass. One investor muttered something under his breath. Another removed his glasses completely and rubbed his eyes. Nathaniel stared at Claire for a long moment without speaking. She did not react to the tension around her. She simply stood there beneath the cold white lights with one hand resting lightly against the conference table. Calm, almost detached, as though this room full of millionaires had no power over her at all. Charles Whitmore, the oldest investor in the room, studied her carefully from across the table. Where exactly did you learn to read acquisition models like that? Claire looked toward him politely. Community college accounting classes, she answered. Daniel scoffed immediately. That is impossible. Claire did not even glance at him. Maybe your model is impossible too. A few people shifted uncomfortably at the sharpness hidden beneath her soft tone. Nathaniel noticed it too. Not arrogance. Precision. There was a difference. He stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the giant screen beside her. Up close, the contrast between them felt almost cinematic. Nathaniel Brooks in his tailored Italian suit worth more than most monthly salaries. Claire Bennett in a black catering uniform with rainwater still drying near the sleeve from her walk into the tower earlier that evening. Yet somehow the power in the room no longer belonged entirely to him. Nathaniel studied the highlighted projections carefully. How much damage are we talking about? Claire answered without hesitation. If the acquisition closes under the current structure, the liquidity pressure could trigger covenant violations within 9 months. Silence. Estimated exposure? Nathaniel asked. Claire inhaled softly. Around $400 million. Nobody moved after that. The city lights flickered against the windows while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. $400 million. Gone because nobody noticed one hidden flaw buried beneath layers of polished presentations and executive confidence. Nathaniel slowly turned toward her again. Who are you? Claire's eyes met his for the first time since entering the room. Pale blue. Steady. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with serving coffee. Just someone who reads carefully, she said quietly. But Nathaniel did not believe her anymore. Not even a little. Because people did not accidentally walk into billion-dollar boardrooms and dismantle financial models between pouring espresso and refilling water glasses. And judging by the growing silence around the table, everyone else had realized the exact same thing. Rain hammered softly against the glass walls of Brooks Capital while the boardroom remained trapped in a silence nobody seemed willing to break first. The presentation screen still glowed above the conference table, flooding the room with pale blue light that reflected across crystal glasses and polished black marble. $400 million. The number lingered in the air heavier than the storm clouds hanging over Manhattan. Nathaniel Brooks slowly walked back toward the center of the room, his attention never leaving Claire Bennett. Most people became smaller under pressure. They talked too quickly, apologized too much, tried desperately to explain themselves. Claire did none of those things. She simply stood beside the giant screen with her hands folded lightly in front of her, calm enough to make powerful people uncomfortable. Daniel Mercer finally pushed back from the table with visible irritation. Nathaniel, this is getting ridiculous. His voice cracked slightly beneath the pressure. Even if there is a discrepancy, we cannot hand over control of this meeting to someone serving coffee. Claire lowered her eyes politely. I never asked for control. No, Daniel snapped. You just walked in here and embarrassed half the executive floor. Nathaniel remained silent. Watching. Measuring. Claire glanced toward Daniel with surprising softness. I was trying to prevent a mistake. And how exactly would you know enough to identify one? Daniel demanded. Do you secretly spend your weekends auditing billion-dollar mergers? The room tightened again. A younger investor shifted awkwardly in his chair, while another pretended to review documents he was no longer reading. Claire looked toward the glowing presentation screen instead of responding immediately. Her eyes moved slowly across the numbers like someone reading a familiar language. Then she spoke quietly. Because numbers behave like people. Several executives exchanged confused looks. Daniel scoffed. What does that even mean? Claire stepped closer to the table. When something looks too perfect, she said softly, it usually means someone forced it to. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Nathaniel's expression changed almost invisibly. Not anger. Recognition. Because deep down, he already knew she was right. Brooks Capital had pushed this acquisition aggressively for months. Fast approvals. Aggressive forecasts. Perfect projections designed to impress investors before competitors could react. Too smooth. Too clean. Too perfect. Nathaniel slowly loosened his cufflinks while staring at the financial report again. Continue, he said quietly. Daniel looked stunned. Nathaniel. I said continue. Claire hesitated for a brief second. Then she reached toward the digital control panel near the wall. May I? Nathaniel gave a small nod. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced confidence. Not random tapping. Not hesitation. She knew exactly where to look. That was what unsettled everyone most. Within seconds, archived spreadsheets appeared beside the main acquisition model. Claire highlighted several columns side by side while the room watched in growing silence. The revised labor projections were imported after the original debt assumptions, she explained. But nobody recalculated the integration volatility. Daniel immediately stood from his chair. That cannot happen automatically inside this system. Claire looked at him calmly. It does if someone bypasses the secondary reconciliation layer. Silence. Daniel's face tightened. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Is she wrong? Daniel looked away for the first time all evening. That answer alone was enough. Investor Charles Whitmore slowly removed his reading glasses and leaned back in his chair. My God, another board member whispered under his breath. She is actually right. The room changed after that. Completely. Claire was no longer invisible. Every eye followed her movements now. Every word mattered. Nathaniel studied her carefully beneath the cold white lights. Her uniform was simple. Black sleeves, white collar, a silver catering badge clipped near her waist. Yet somehow she looked more composed than the executives earning seven-figure salaries around her. Where did you say you learned accounting? Nathaniel asked quietly. Claire gave the faintest smile. Not mocking. Almost sad. I did not. Daniel folded his arms tightly. Nobody talks like this without formal training. Claire looked toward him gently. You would be surprised how much people can learn when life becomes expensive. The room fell quiet again. Something about the way she said it carried weight beyond finance. Nathaniel noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath her calm expression now. Not physical exhaustion. Something older. He suddenly realized her hands were perfectly steady. No nervous tapping. No fidgeting. People did not remain that calm in front of billionaires unless they had already survived worse things than embarrassment. Thunder rolled across the skyline again, shaking the glass walls softly. One of the younger analysts finally whispered, How did nobody catch this? Claire answered before anyone else could. Because everyone was busy trying to close the deal. Nathaniel looked toward the giant windows overlooking Manhattan. Endless towers glowing through the rain. Endless meetings. Endless negotiations. For years he had rewarded speed above caution. Results above reflection. Maybe that culture had finally reached its breaking point. Slowly, he turned back toward Claire. Tell me something honestly. His voice lowered. Quieter now. More human. If you had not spilled that coffee tonight. Claire finished the thought for him softly. You would have signed the deal tomorrow morning. Nobody spoke after that. Somewhere far below the tower, sirens echoed faintly through the wet Manhattan streets. Inside the boardroom, the silence felt different now. Less arrogant. Less certain. Nathaniel Brooks stared at the woman standing beside his billion-dollar presentation and realized something deeply uncomfortable. The most important person in the room had entered carrying a coffee tray, and he almost never looked at her at all. The storm outside Brooks' capital grew heavier as midnight approached, turning the Manhattan skyline into blurred rivers of gold and white beneath the rain. Inside the boardroom, nobody had touched the catered food arranged neatly against the far wall. Half-full coffee cups sat forgotten beside glowing tablets and scattered financial reports. The acquisition meeting had stopped feeling like a presentation nearly an hour ago. Now it felt more like an interrogation nobody was prepared for. Claire Bennett stood quietly near the digital screen while executives whispered to each other in low voices that carried traces of disbelief and embarrassment. Nathaniel Brooks remained at the head of the conference table, one hand resting against the leather chair in front of him. He had built Brooks' capital by trusting instincts faster than anyone else in the room. Tonight, every instinct he had was telling him the same thing. Claire Bennett was hiding something. Run the revised risk exposure again, Nathaniel said without taking his eyes off the screen. Daniel Mercer nodded stiffly and reopened the financial model. His movements had lost their earlier confidence now. The room watched him carefully while rows of numbers shifted across the giant display. Tick, tick, tick. The clock near the glass doors sounded louder than before. Claire remained completely silent during the recalculation. Calm, motionless, like someone who already knew what the outcome would be. Nathaniel noticed every detail. The way she stood with relaxed shoulders instead of defensive posture. The way her eyes scanned projections before they even fully loaded onto the screen. The way she never once tried to impress anyone in the room. People desperate for attention usually spoke too much. Claire only spoke when necessary. Somehow that gave her words more weight. Daniel finally stopped typing. His face tightened immediately. The revised debt pressure is worse than expected. One investor leaned forward sharply. How much worse? Daniel hesitated. Potentially $520 million over 3 fiscal years. A quiet curse slipped from someone near the far end of the table. Another investor slowly removed his watch and rubbed both hands across his face. Nathaniel remained perfectly still, but the muscles in his jaw tightened slightly. $500 million. Gone because nobody questioned the model aggressively enough. Or maybe because everyone trusted reputation more than detail. Nathaniel looked toward Claire again. You saw all of this from one glance. Claire shook her head gently. Not all of it. Then what did you see? She looked toward the glowing spreadsheets. The percentages were too clean. Daniel let out a frustrated breath. You keep saying things like that as if finance is intuition instead of mathematics. Claire turned toward him calmly. Good finance is human behavior wearing numbers as a disguise. Silence. Charles Whitmore slowly smiled beneath his gray mustache for the first time all evening. That, he muttered softly, is not community college language. Claire lowered her gaze slightly. People say many things when they are tired. Nathaniel studied her carefully. Her uniform sleeve was still slightly damp near the wrist from the spilled coffee earlier. Tiny details suddenly stood out to him now. The careful way she spoke. The precision of her observations. Even the way she carried silence felt educated. He had spent 20 years negotiating with executives, hedge fund managers, attorneys, and political donors. Claire Bennett sounded nothing like service staff. And yet there she stood in a catering uniform under fluorescent lights after midnight. It made no sense. Who hired your catering company? Nathaniel asked suddenly. Claire blinked once at the change in subject. Harper Hospitality Services. How long have you worked for them? About 8 months. Daniel looked up sharply from his tablet. 8 months serving coffee, and suddenly, she can dismantle merger structures. Claire answered before Nathaniel could. People do what they must after life changes. Again, the room quieted after her words. She never explained fully, never invited sympathy, but every answer hinted at a story nobody in the room understood yet. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the massive windows overlooking the city. Below them, traffic crawled through the rain like streams of red light bleeding across wet pavement. He remembered growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens with a father who worked 18-hour shifts repairing elevators. Back then, Nathaniel promised himself he would never become powerless again, never invisible again. Somewhere along the way, he had started believing powerful people always looked powerful. Tonight challenged that belief in ways he could not ignore. Behind him, Claire quietly gathered a few empty coffee cups from the conference table. The movement almost startled him. After everything that had happened, she was still doing her job, still cleaning up after people who had mocked her less than an hour earlier. Charles Whitmore noticed it too. Miss Bennett, he said gently, why are you still serving us? Claire paused beside the table. For the first time that evening, something faintly sad crossed her expression. Because that is what I was hired to do. Nobody answered. The sentence carried more dignity than resentment. Somehow that made it heavier. Nathaniel turned back toward her slowly. No, he said quietly. That is not all you were hired to do. Claire met his eyes again. Calm blue against cold gray. Rain shimmered behind them across the glass walls of the tower. With respect, Mr. Brooks, she replied softly. Most people only see the uniform first. The room fell silent once more. And this time, nobody looked at the catering badge clipped beside her waist. They looked at her the way people look at someone after realizing they completely misunderstood who was standing in front of them all along. By 12:30 in the morning, the storm over Manhattan had become violent enough to shake the upper glass panels of Brooks' Capitol Tower. Rain slammed against the windows in restless waves while distant thunder rolled between skyscrapers like slow-moving drums. Yet inside the boardroom, nobody noticed the weather anymore. Every ounce of attention remained fixed on Claire Bennett. The catering tray she carried earlier now sat forgotten near the far wall beside untouched desserts and cold coffee. The executives who once ignored her completely were now studying every movement she made as though one sentence from her could either save or destroy the company sitting beneath their feet. Daniel Mercer continued reviewing the revised acquisition numbers, with growing frustration visible across his face. Every recalculation only confirmed the same conclusion. Claire had been right from the beginning. Nathaniel Brooks stood near the windows with one hand in his pocket, watching reflections move across the glass instead of looking directly at anyone in the room. He hated mistakes, but what he hated more was realizing someone outside his trusted executive circle had identified a fatal flaw before his own leadership team did. That kind of failure did not happen at Brooks Capital. At least, it was not supposed to. Run the stress scenario under reduced market confidence, Nathaniel said quietly. Daniel immediately shook his head. There is no point anymore. The structure is unstable. Run it anyway. The room fell silent again as Daniel reluctantly entered another sequence into the financial model. Claire remained standing near the end of the conference table, her posture relaxed despite the tension surrounding her. She looked exhausted now beneath the harsh boardroom lighting. Not physically exhausted, emotionally, like someone who had spent years learning how to disappear quietly inside rooms full of powerful people. Charles Whitmore studied her carefully before finally speaking. Miss Bennet. Claire looked toward him politely. Yes, sir. What would you do differently? Daniel let out a quiet breath of irritation. Charles, we cannot seriously ask a waitress to redesign a corporate acquisition strategy. But Nathaniel spoke before anyone else could respond. Actually, he said calmly, I would like to hear her answer. Claire hesitated for the first time all evening. Not because she lacked confidence. Because she understood exactly how dangerous honesty could become in rooms like this. She slowly walked toward the presentation screen again, while lightning briefly illuminated the skyline behind her. The digital projections reflected softly across her face as she studied the numbers in silence. Then she pointed toward one section of the model. The acquisition itself is not the problem. Several heads lifted immediately. Claire continued quietly. Your timeline is. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes slightly. Explain. You are trying to absorb 3 regional operations simultaneously while restructuring labor, refinancing debt, and increasing shareholder expectations in the same fiscal cycle. She looked around the room calmly. That is not expansion. That is panic wearing expensive clothes. Silence. Complete silence. One investor actually looked down at the table after she said it. Daniel folded his arms tightly. You are oversimplifying an extremely sophisticated financial strategy. Claire nodded once. No, I am simplifying a human one. Nathaniel slowly turned toward her now. Fully attentive, Claire continued carefully, never raising her voice. Everyone in this room is focused on how large the company becomes after the acquisition. She glanced toward the glowing city outside the windows. Nobody is asking whether the company can still breathe afterward. The sentence settled heavily across the boardroom. Even Daniel stopped interrupting her. Claire stepped closer to the screen and adjusted the projection timeline herself. Delay the 3rd regional integration by 9 months, she said softly. Reduce immediate staffing cuts. Preserve liquidity instead of forcing short-term valuation spikes. Numbers shifted across the screen again. The projected losses immediately dropped. One analyst quietly muttered, "That is impossible." Another whispered, "No. Wait." Daniel stared at the recalculated model in disbelief. Nathaniel walked closer beside Claire, studying the new projections carefully. The market would react negatively to a slower rollout. Claire nodded. For 1 quarter. And after that? Nathaniel asked. Claire looked directly at him. After that, your company survives. Nobody moved. Rain continued streaking across the giant windows while the boardroom lights reflected against wet glass like fractured stars. Nathaniel Brooks had spent years surrounding himself with aggressive executives who spoke loudly and moved quickly because confidence impressed investors. Claire Bennet did none of those things. Yet somehow she controlled the room more completely than anyone there. Not through authority, through clarity. Daniel finally pushed his chair back sharply and stood. Who are you? The question came out harsher than intended. Claire remained calm. I already told you. No. Daniel snapped quietly. You did not. Nathaniel noticed something then. The moment Daniel asked the question, Claire's expression changed almost invisibly. Not fear. Pain. Brief and carefully hidden. But Nathaniel saw it. Claire looked toward the rain outside before answering softly. I am someone who learned what happens when intelligent people stop listening to quiet voices. The room fell silent again. Charles Whitmore slowly removed his glasses and stared at her with growing realization. Good Lord, he whispered. I know you from somewhere. Claire immediately lowered her eyes. Nathaniel noticed that too. For the first time all evening, she looked uncomfortable. Not because of the financial pressure, because she did not want to be recognized. And suddenly Nathaniel Brooks understood something deeply unsettling. Claire Bennett had not walked into this boardroom by accident. She had walked back into a world she had clearly spent years trying to escape. The atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted again after Charles Whitmore spoke those quiet words. I know you from somewhere. Nobody moved immediately. Rain continued racing down the towering glass walls while lightning flickered across the Manhattan skyline in pale bursts of silver. Claire Bennett stood near the presentation screen with her hands lightly folded in front of her, but Nathaniel Brooks noticed the subtle change in her breathing now. Smaller, controlled, like someone preparing for impact without wanting anyone else to notice. Charles leaned forward slowly in his chair, studying her face beneath the cold white lighting. You worked in strategic restructuring, he murmured softly. Did you not? Claire lowered her eyes. Silence. Daniel Mercer looked between them with growing confusion. Charles, who exactly is she? But the older investor did not answer immediately. His attention never left Claire. 5 years ago, he continued carefully. There was a recovery proposal circulating through several New York firms after the Hanover collapse. Nathaniel's expression sharpened slightly at the name. Everyone on Wall Street remembered Hanover Capital, one of the fastest corporate collapses in modern finance. Billions lost within months because executives expanded too aggressively while hiding liquidity instability beneath inflated projections. Charles Whitmore slowly pointed toward the presentation screen still glowing behind Claire. The language you used earlier about operational breathing. He paused. I have heard that before. Claire remained motionless. Charles, Nathaniel said quietly, what are you talking about? The older man removed his glasses slowly. There was an anonymous restructuring paper passed privately between firms after Hanover collapsed. It predicted 3 market failures almost 2 years before they happened. Daniel frowned immediately. I remember that paper. One of the investors near the far end of the table suddenly looked up sharply. The Phoenix recovery strategy. Silence spread instantly across the room. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. He remembered it too now. Every major investment firm on the East Coast had discussed that strategy years earlier. Nobody knew who wrote it. Nobody could trace the source. But the paper became legendary because nearly every prediction inside it came true. Entire companies quietly rebuilt their financial structures around its recommendations, including Brooks Capital. Nathaniel slowly turned toward Claire. You know about the Phoenix strategy? Claire's expression remained calm, but she no longer looked comfortable. Most people in finance know about it. Charles Whitmore shook his head slowly. Not like this. He leaned closer. The wording is identical. Nobody spoke. Rain hammered harder against the windows now, surrounding the room with a low, endless roar. Daniel stared at Claire with growing disbelief. No, he muttered quietly. That is impossible. Nathaniel's voice lowered. Claire. She finally looked at him again. Pale blue eyes. Tired eyes. Honest eyes. Did you write it? The room stopped breathing. Claire looked toward the city outside before answering softly. I wrote the first draft. Silence. Total silence. Daniel actually laughed once in disbelief before stopping himself. No, Charles Whitmore leaned back heavily in his chair. My God. Nathaniel felt something cold move through his chest. The Phoenix recovery strategy had saved Brooks Capital during its most vulnerable years. 5 years earlier, before the company exploded into one of the largest private equity firms in the country, Nathaniel had quietly used portions of that anonymous strategy to stabilize debt exposure after a disastrous expansion cycle. He never knew who created it. Nobody did. Until now. Nathaniel stared at Claire Bennett standing beneath fluorescent lights in a catering uniform, and suddenly the room no longer made sense. If you wrote the Phoenix strategy, Daniel demanded carefully, why are you serving coffee? Claire gave a faint smile that carried no humor at all. Life changes quickly. That paper reshaped half the market. Another investor whispered. You could have worked anywhere. Claire remained silent for a moment before answering. Not after what happened. Nathaniel noticed it immediately. The shift in the room. People were no longer looking at her with curiosity now. They were looking at her with respect. Real respect. The kind powerful people almost never gave freely. And somehow that realization unsettled him more than the financial crisis itself. Charles Whitmore spoke gently this time. The rumors said the original analyst disappeared after a scandal. Claire's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Rumors are usually louder than truth. Nathaniel stepped closer. What scandal? Claire looked down briefly at the silver catering badge clipped beside her waist. Someone above me submitted my work under his own name during a restructuring deal. The room remained silent. When the project collapsed politically, she continued softly. The blame traveled downward faster than the credit ever did. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in finance understood exactly what she meant. Nathaniel did too. Claire continued calmly, never asking for sympathy. My father became ill during the investigation. Hospital bills grew faster than legal fees. Eventually, she glanced around the room lightly. Survival became more important than reputation. No tears, no anger. Somehow that made every word heavier. Charles Whitmore slowly shook his head. They buried you. Claire answered quietly. No. She looked toward the storm outside. They buried my name. There is a difference. The room fell silent once more. Nathaniel Brooks suddenly remembered every arrogant sentence he had spoken to her earlier that evening. Some numbers here are worth more than your entire life. The memory landed inside him like shame wrapped in ice. Because standing in front of him was not an uneducated waitress who accidentally noticed a mistake. She was the invisible architect behind one of the most respected financial recovery strategies on Wall Street. And he had mocked her before he even learned her name. For several long seconds after Claire Bennett admitted she wrote the first draft of the Phoenix recovery strategy, nobody inside the boardroom spoke at all. The storm outside seemed quieter somehow, as if even the rain had paused to listen. Manhattan shimmered beneath the glass walls in silver reflections, while the digital presentation screen continued glowing behind Claire with revised financial projections nobody cared about anymore. The acquisition meeting had become something else entirely. Nathaniel Brooks stood motionless near the center of the room, staring at the woman he had dismissed less than 2 hours earlier, as though his mind was trying to rebuild reality around information it could barely process. The Phoenix strategy had shaped his career. 5 years ago, when Brooks' capital balanced dangerously close to collapse during a volatile expansion cycle, that anonymous paper had provided the framework that stabilized his company long enough to survive. Entire divisions were restructured around its principles. Investors praised Nathaniel for his foresight afterward. Financial magazines called him visionary. Yet the person responsible for that strategy had spent the evening refilling coffee cups while executives ignored her existence. The realization sat inside him like something heavy and deeply unpleasant. Daniel Mercer finally broke the silence first. If all this is true, he said carefully, why did nobody come forward publicly after the strategy circulated? Claire looked toward him calmly. Because the person who submitted it officially had senior protection. Meaning? Daniel asked. Claire folded her hands lightly together. Meaning he had the kind of last name people listened to faster than evidence. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Nobody asked for the name. Deep down, everyone understood the system she was describing because they had all benefited from it at some point. Nathaniel noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath Claire's composure growing more visible now. Not weakness. Fatigue from carrying silence too long. Charles Whitmore leaned forward again, his expression softer than before. You disappeared completely after that investigation. Claire nodded once. That was the idea. You could have fought it, another investor said quietly. Claire gave a faint smile. With what resources? Nobody answered. Nathaniel slowly walked toward the conference table and stared down at the cold espresso sitting untouched beside his leather folder. Earlier that evening, he had spoken to Claire like she was insignificant, replaceable, invisible. Now every sentence replayed inside his head with unbearable clarity. Some numbers here are worth more than your entire life. He suddenly hated the memory of his own voice. Claire turned slightly toward the catering tray near the wall. I should probably clean up before the morning staff arrives. The sentence stunned the room more than anything else she had said all night. Daniel looked at her in disbelief. After everything that just happened, you are worried about cleaning up? Claire glanced toward him calmly. Someone has to. Nathaniel lifted his eyes slowly toward her again. There it was. The difference between them. Everyone in the room had spent years protecting titles, reputations, and appearances. Claire Bennett protected responsibility instead. Even now, even after being humiliated, even after proving herself smarter than nearly everyone present. Charles Whitmore spoke quietly. You know, most people would feel angry. Claire looked toward the rain beyond the glass walls. Anger is expensive. Her voice remained soft. I could not afford it for very long. Silence settled over the room once more. Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest now. Not embarrassment exactly. Something heavier. Regret. Real regret. He built his company believing strength meant dominance. Efficiency. Authority. Tonight, a woman wearing a catering badge had exposed a flaw in both his acquisition strategy and his character without ever raising her voice once. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the giant windows overlooking the city. Reflections moved across the glass, blending his image with thousands of lights below. He remembered the younger version of himself who once swore he would never treat people the way wealthy executives treated his father. Somewhere between ambition and success, he had become exactly the kind of man he used to resent. Behind him, Claire quietly began gathering abandoned coffee cups from the table. The sound of porcelain touching silver echoed softly through the silent room. Nathaniel turned back toward her. Stop. Claire paused. Sir, stop cleaning. Her hand remained resting lightly against the silver tray. It is my job. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. No, his voice lowered. Honest now. It is just the job people left you with. The room became completely still. Claire looked at him for a long moment, surprised by something in his tone she clearly had not expected. Sincerity. Nathaniel stepped closer carefully. I owe you an apology. Several executives looked visibly uncomfortable hearing those words from him. Nathaniel Brooks almost never apologized publicly. Claire remained calm, but her eyes softened slightly with confusion more than emotion. Nathaniel continued quietly. Not because you were right about the acquisition. He glanced briefly toward the glowing financial reports. Because I looked at your uniform before I looked at you. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Rain continued tracing slow rivers down the windows behind them while the city lights shimmered through the storm. Claire studied him silently before answering. Most people do. Nathaniel swallowed slowly. That does not make it acceptable. The room fell silent again after that. Somewhere below the tower, a police siren echoed faintly through wet streets before disappearing into the night. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the catering badge clipped near her waist. You know what the strange part is? She asked softly. Nathaniel frowned slightly. What? Claire looked back at him with a small, tired smile. I was actually proud of this job. The sentence landed harder than anything else she had said all evening, because there was no bitterness in it. No shame. Just quiet dignity. And in that moment, Nathaniel Brooks realized the most powerful person inside Brooks Capital Tower was not the billionaire standing beside the windows. It was the woman who lost everything and still refused to become cruel. By 1:15 in the morning, Brooks Capital Tower felt strangely hollow. Most of the junior staff on lower floors had already gone home hours earlier, leaving the skyscraper wrapped in silence except for distant elevator chimes and the steady rhythm of rain striking glass. Inside the executive boardroom, nobody seemed interested in ending the meeting anymore. The financial crisis that began the evening had become secondary to something far more uncomfortable. Self-awareness. Claire Bennett quietly finished gathering the last empty coffee cups from the conference table while executives watched her with expressions that no longer carried superiority. Only reflection. Nathaniel Brooks stood near the windows with his loosened tie hanging slightly crooked now, something that would have been unthinkable earlier that evening. The polished certainty he usually carried into every room had cracked. Not dramatically, quietly, and somehow that made it more real. Daniel Mercer finally sat back down heavily in his chair and stared at the revised acquisition model glowing across the giant screen. We built an entire expansion strategy around unstable assumptions, he muttered. How did nobody catch this? Claire carefully placed another cup onto the silver tray before answering softly. Because confidence can sound a lot like competence when nobody slows down long enough to question it. Nobody argued with her anymore. Nathaniel noticed that too. Earlier, every sentence she spoke was challenged immediately. Now the room listened before she even finished talking. Respect had replaced dismissal without anyone formally acknowledging the shift. Charles Whitmore folded his hands together thoughtfully. "You know what troubles me most?" he said quietly. Several heads turned toward him. The older investor looked directly at Nathaniel. Not one person in this room recognized the mind that helped save half our companies because she was carrying coffee. Silence settled again. Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly. The truth inside Charles's words felt impossible to avoid now. Claire moved toward the side counter where untouched desserts still sat beneath polished silver covers. Tiny details suddenly stood out to Nathaniel in ways they never would have before. The careful way she aligned plates automatically after moving them. The way she cleaned small water rings from the table without drawing attention to herself. Years of invisibility had taught her how to move through powerful spaces without disturbing anyone. And tonight, for the first time in years, people finally stopped overlooking her. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the center of the room again. "Cancel tomorrow morning's acquisition announcement," he said quietly. Daniel looked up immediately. "Nathaniel, the media release is already scheduled." "Then unschedule it." His tone remained calm. "Final. We restructure before moving forward." Several investors exchanged surprised glances, but none objected. Claire looked toward Nathaniel with visible surprise for the first time all evening. "You are willing to delay the acquisition publicly?" Nathaniel met her eyes directly. "I would rather survive criticism than collapse with confidence." Something faint crossed Claire's expression then. Not satisfaction. Respect. Small but genuine. Nathaniel noticed it immediately. Strange how meaningful, simple respect suddenly felt coming from someone he had treated so poorly only hours earlier. Daniel slowly rubbed his forehead. "The board is going to panic," Claire answered quietly while arranging porcelain cups beside the tray. "People panic less when leaders admit mistakes early." Nathaniel looked toward her. "And if admitting mistakes damages confidence?" Claire gave a faint, tired smile. "Then maybe the confidence was built on performance instead of truth." The room became still once more. Every sentence she spoke seemed to peel away another layer of artificial certainty from the people around her. Nathaniel suddenly understood why the Phoenix recovery strategy became legendary years ago. It was never just about finance. It was about humility disguised as analysis. Charles Whitmore slowly stood from his chair and walked toward Claire. "Miss Bennett," he said gently, "Wall Street buried your name, but they never buried your mind." Claire lowered her gaze slightly. "That is kind of you to say." "It is true." Charles reached into his suit pocket and handed her an elegant business card embossed with silver lettering. "If you ever decide to return to finance, call me directly." Claire accepted the card politely, but did not look at it. Nathaniel noticed that too. Most people in New York would have treated that card like a winning lottery ticket. Claire treated it like paper. Daniel watched her carefully now. "You really walked away from all of it?" Claire looked toward the rain beyond the glass walls. "Not at first." Her voice softened slightly. "At first I kept trying to explain myself." The room remained silent. "Then one day," she continued, "I realized powerful people rarely ask for the truth unless the truth benefits them." Nathaniel felt those words land directly inside him. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Earlier that evening, he only listened to Claire after she became useful to him. Before that, she was background noise carrying coffee through a room full of executives. The realization felt uglier every minute. Claire finally lifted the silver tray again and moved toward the boardroom doors. "It is late," she said softly. "The cleaning crew will arrive soon." Nathaniel stepped forward instinctively. "Claire." She paused beside the doorway. The city lights behind her shimmered through rain-covered glass like distant stars drowning beneath water. Nathaniel swallowed slowly before speaking. "What you did tonight saved this company." Claire looked at him quietly for a moment. Then she answered with the calm honesty that had dismantled the room from the beginning. "No, Mr. Brooks." Her pale blue eyes held his steadily. "I only pointed at the crack. Whether the company survives depends on whether people inside it finally choose to see each other clearly." Nobody spoke after that. Not because they disagreed. Because every person in the room understood she was no longer talking only about finance. The boardroom finally emptied a little after 2 in the morning. One by one, Executives gathered their tablets and leather folders before quietly leaving through the glass doors with expressions far more subdued than when the evening began. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. Nobody carried the sharp confidence that usually filled Brooks' Capitol Tower after major meetings. The storm outside still covered Manhattan in rain and silver fog, but inside the skyscraper something else had settled over the building. Perspective. Claire Bennett finished stacking the final coffee cups onto the silver catering tray while maintenance staff quietly moved through the hallway outside. The giant presentation screen had gone dark now, leaving only soft city reflections drifting across the glass walls of the boardroom. Nathaniel Brooks remained near the windows long after everyone else left. His suit jacket rested over the back of a chair, sleeves rolled slightly above his wrist for the first time in years during a corporate meeting. He watched Claire silently as she wiped the conference table clean with slow, practiced movements. There was something deeply humbling about it. Hours earlier, she had exposed flaws capable of destroying a $500 million acquisition. Now she was carefully removing water rings left behind by people who once ignored her existence. Nathaniel finally spoke quietly. "You really were going to leave tonight without saying who you were?" Claire folded the cloth neatly beside the tray. "Nobody asked." Nathaniel lowered his eyes briefly. The sentence hurt more than it should have, because it was true. Nobody had cared enough to ask until her intelligence became useful. Claire lifted the tray gently and moved toward the door. Nathaniel stepped forward instinctively. "Wait." She paused. Rain shimmered behind her across the dark windows while the city lights reflected softly against the polished marble floor. Nathaniel walked toward the conference table and opened one of the abandoned financial folders still lying there. From inside, he carefully removed a yellowed document protected beneath clear plastic. Claire's expression changed the moment she saw it. The original Phoenix recovery draft. Nathaniel held it carefully in both hands before looking back at her. "I found this in the archived restructuring files downstairs 20 minutes ago." Claire remained silent. Nathaniel glanced toward the faded signature line near the bottom corner of the document. Empty. No name. Just blank space where recognition should have existed years earlier. "You know what bothers me most?" he asked quietly. Claire looked toward him calmly. Nathaniel swallowed slowly before continuing. "I built part of my company using ideas from this document." His voice softened. "And I never once thought about the person who wrote it." The room fell silent again. Somewhere beyond the tower, thunder rolled softly across the sleeping city. Claire stepped closer to the table, her eyes resting briefly on the old document before drifting away again. "Most people only care about outcomes," she said gently. "Not authors." Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "That is not good enough anymore." He reached into his pocket and removed a silver fountain pen. Then, without another word, he placed the document flat against the conference table and carefully wrote 2 words onto the empty signature line. "Claire Bennett." The sound of the pen moving across paper seemed louder than the storm outside. Nathaniel stepped back once he finished and looked at her quietly. It should have been there from the beginning. Claire stared at the signature for several long seconds. No dramatic reaction. No tears. Just silence carrying years of invisible weight, finally settling somewhere softer. Nathaniel noticed her hands tremble slightly for the first time all night. Only once. Only briefly. "You do not owe me this," she whispered. Nathaniel looked at her honestly. "Maybe not." He paused. "But I owe it to the truth." The boardroom lights reflected softly across the old document, while rain continued tracing silver lines down the windows behind them. Claire carefully touched the edge of the paper with her fingertips like someone afraid the moment might disappear if she moved too quickly. "You know," Nathaniel said quietly, "when you walked into this room tonight, I thought power belonged to whoever controlled the meeting." Claire lifted her eyes toward him. Nathaniel gave a faint, humorless smile. "Turns out I was wrong." Silence again, but not uncomfortable anymore. Just human. Claire slowly picked up the signed document and held it gently against her chest beside the silver tray. "Thank you," she said softly. Nathaniel nodded once. "Will you come back?" Claire looked toward the sleeping city outside the glass walls. Endless lights. Endless towers. Endless people trying desperately to matter. "I do not know," she admitted quietly. "Finance was never what broke me." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Then what did?" Claire met his eyes one final time before answering. being invisible in rooms full of people who only respected power. The words settled deeply between them, because now Nathaniel understood exactly what she meant. He walked toward the glass doors and opened them for her without speaking. Claire paused beside him for a brief moment before stepping into the quiet hallway with the silver tray in one hand and the signed document in the other. Halfway down the corridor, she stopped and glanced back once. Nathaniel still stood inside the boardroom alone beneath the dim lights of the city. For the first time in years, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man finally learning how to see people clearly. Claire gave a small, tired smile before turning toward the elevators. The doors closed softly behind her moments later. Nathaniel remained standing there long after she disappeared, listening to the rain against the windows and staring at the empty chair where she had once stood carrying coffee no one thought twice about. And somewhere between the storm outside and the silence inside, Nathaniel Brooks realized something he would never forget for the rest of his life. The quiet ones were never truly ordinary.